Let's get this started. Hello. I hope you're doing well. Hopefully, the internet holds up well enough. Fortunately, for these journal clubs, we don't need fantastic internet since you could pull up the paper next to you. Anyways, so today I decided to go through one of Tim Weiland's papers, one of our favorite authors or scientists. Let me pull up my desktop screen here so you can see what I'm looking at. And there we go. Misuse and Diversion of Stimulants Prescribed for ADHD, a systematic review of the literature. So this is a type of study where they look at a bunch of different studies that exist in the literature and collect them all into one place and try to understand what the aggregate data says. So because it's a study about studies, this is a meta study. That's what some people call it, or a meta-analysis. In this case, I don't think they don't actually do any analysis, but you know what I mean. All right. Let's get started. They use a couple abbreviations, AMPH, MPH in this study. I assume these are common in the field. Just wanted to point that out. And I'll just say them, I'll verbalize them because I don't want to, it's just annoying to remember abbreviations. And all right, so the whole idea of this paper is to understand what are the abuse rates. And now we're not necessarily focusing on people with ADHD and the abuse rates of medication of those people. We're looking at overall abuse rates and trying to figure out under which demographics abuse is most relevant or happens most, and also try to understand the causes for the abuse. And I'll go through this pretty quickly. This is one of the most dry, boring papers I've ever read. It's literally effectively a list of all the different studies that exist. And so, what else can you really do in terms of actually writing this thing? All right, so in the intro, they make it clear that the purpose of the systematic review is to evaluate the extent and context of stimulant misuse in individuals with and without ADHD. And let me actually zoom in, make the text a little bigger here. That's as big as I can get it. Okay. Yeah, that seems to be showing up clearly. And they also want to answer questions like what is the rate of misuse of ADHD stimulant medications in adolescents and young adults, both with and without ADHD? What is the rate of diversion of ADHD stimulant medications? Who is at greatest risk, and in what context do misuse and diversion occur? And they're careful to define these terms. So misuse, they mentioned that it includes taking ADHD prescriptions not prescribed to the individual or taking prescriptions differently than they were prescribed. That's misuse, and they collapse all of these different terms for misuse. If they find that in the literature as they're searching, then they just group that under the single word misuse. For diversion, this is the transfer of prescriptions from one individual who does have a prescription to another individual who does not have a prescription. And they look at both of these. I won't focus on diversion too much. I'll very briefly I'll just summarize some of the studies they talk about with regards to misuse. And for the methodology, I found it very interesting that they just searched through PubMed. And if you're unfamiliar with PubMed, it's a repository or like a centralized search engine for publications. And really any kind of publications, despite the med part of the name. So they just use this basically a search engine, and they use the terms misuse, diversion, stimulants, illicit use, and ADHD medications, and searched between 1995 and 2006. And this paper was published in 2007. Yeah, it was published in 2007, and so that the search criterion makes sense. And they go into a little detail about how, whether or not they excluded or included things. And as for the actual data, they found 21 studies that fit the criteria they were looking for. This included 113,000 study participants, pretty good sample size. And for these different studies, there's a different breakdown. So there's 4 of them had high school students, 12 of them were about college students, 6 of them included mixed age groups, 17 were from schools or colleges, and let's see, one was from a sample of individuals with ADHD. A couple were from substance use treatment centers, and a couple were from national drug use surveys. So diverse list, and as you can imagine, the methodology is all over the place, right? And so it's very hard to draw conclusions. So the best we can really do is just state what the results are. And I'll go into some in this table and summarize at the end. All right. A big confusion I have with trying to read this type of paper, I don't really know how to read it. So that's something to keep in mind as I explain things to you. I'm by no means an expert on reading meta studies. So for example, if we take this study by Babcock and Byrne, this was a study done with using 283 students at a public liberal arts college, self-reported college survey by via mail, mean of 21 years old. 17% reported ever having used methylphenidate recreationally, 13% reported lifetime intranasal use. So it seems like 17% abused stimulant medication, specifically methylphenidate, and a small proportion of those used them nasally. And if we compare this to McCabe et al., they had a study with over 10,000, almost 11,000 randomly selected students from 119 four-year colleges. So just incredible diversity. There, it was reported that lifetime stimulant misuse was at a rate of 6.9%. And in the past year, students reported 4.1%. Within the past month, 2.1%. So these numbers are they're significantly smaller relative to the first study we were looking at, Babcock and Byrne. So it's hard to know exactly how to take this. In fact, the study seems to be also with me there with the confusion on how to interpret things. We'll get to that if I remember. Of course, I never know if I remember, and I forget if I'm supposed to remember something or not. But anyways, the other interesting thing I found with this is the fact that in a lot of cases of stimulant misuse, when stimulant misuse is reported, it often happens to be comorbid with other types of substance abuse. So in this case, 36% of the sample, let's see, this was a convenient sample. I don't know what convenient sample means, but 150 undergraduates in a psychology class at a small competitive U.S. college, self-reported written survey. 36% of them reported past year misuse of stimulants. Again, very different numbers from the couple other studies we're looking at. Misuse associated with the use of cocaine and MDMA. All right, all students with prescriptions were considered non-abusers. Single site study from a small competitive college. So it's unclear exactly, if it was like a high rate of comorbidity. I guess we'd have to jump into the paper. I'm sure the information is in there. But that seems to be a common theme, that there's, if someone is abusing stimulant medication, it's likely that they are also abusing other things. It's not just stimulant medication. Okay, and this one confused me. I don't know if this was a sample of ADHD people. N equals 100, 50% reporting. Oh, okay. So they just had 100 samples. 50% of them reported methylphenidate misuse. 50% were controls. Standard face-to-face structured interviews of all participants. So 70%, I assume, out of the 100, or was it out of the, I don't know. But 70% misused stimulants recreationally. 30% for studying over their lifetime. Those using stimulants report more drug use overall. So that second part is consistent with what I was just saying. And the first part, again, I don't understand. So this is what I mean by I don't know how to interpret these meta studies. It's nice that they have this table summarizing things, but 70% of what part of the sample size reported misusing what. So anyways, that's a little beside the point. And then White et al. Here it's a study of 1,000 undergraduates, 16% misused or abused stimulants in their lifetime, and 40% of those abused the medication intranasally. So they would crush it up and snort it, which, by the way, apparently is a pretty clear indicator that you might be that you are abusing medication, so a stimulant medication. So, just kind of yeah, I just keep an eye on yourself. I certainly keep an eye on myself, making sure that I'm not breaking apart my extended release capsules and grinding them up, crushing them and snorting them. All right, so that's the data that I'll go over. Everything else is within that range. I think the lowest percentage was something like 5.3%, or was, yeah, so, on the order of 5% or 3%, pretty low, single digits, to all the way up to 36% in these larger surveys. The 71% up here, I think those are specialized. Yeah, like 70% here. Those are special samples that of course have different numbers relative to the general population. Okay, but you're welcome to take a look. I can't remember if this is behind a paywall or not, but yeah, at least the sources are here. You can very easily look up the bibliography of these things, even if the paper is behind a paywall. So I encourage you to look at that if you are curious. And let's go back to the text. I'll skip forward to the context of stimulant misuse, abuse, and diversion. And Teeter and colleagues found that 58% of college students misusing stimulants reported stimulants to concentrate. So just a list of motivations for using stimulants. So a proportion wanted to use it to concentrate. Some used it for alertness. Others used it to just get high. 14% had some other motivation that didn't fall under these broader categories. And in an independent sample from the same group, 60% misused stimulants to study, 48% to improve alertness, 31% to get high, and 30% for experimentation. And in White et al., motivation was partying and improving grades and paying attention. So it tends to be a couple things. It's either academic related, trying to perform better, or recreationally related, trying to enhance whatever you're doing for fun. As part of a longitudinal study of ADHD, Weilands et al. Reported that 22% took higher doses than prescribed or misused their own prescribed medication. So this particular study, if I'm reading this correctly, is about specifically people with ADHD. And apparently 22% of people with ADHD who have medication will take a higher dose than prescribed, and they'll misuse their own prescribed medication, which is really unfortunate. 10% got high on their medication. That was the motivation for using that. And 16% of subjects with ADHD withheld their medication around times of using drugs or alcohol. So I assume that just means if they were taking other drugs, they would just put their medication on hold for the time being. Yeah, so that number is a little higher than I was expecting. That probably means that if you have ADHD and you are unmedicated, the risk of drug abuse in general is probably pretty high relative to the general population. And then on medication, it reduces to an abuse rate of 22%. Yeah, that's probably what this means. So it's unfortunate that it happens, but at least we know about it. I don't know what to do with this information, but I just want to learn, and I know that you guys do too. So there you go. Comorbidity with stimulant misuse. The aggregate data from studies reported above seem to suggest that individuals who misuse stimulants may have other psychiatric disorders such as conduct disorder, CD, and/or SA, substance abuse. That's what the SA stands for. And this is a really important point. That might be a huge proportion of the 22% that took higher doses than prescribed or misused their own prescribed medication might have some other underlying issue, such as conduct disorder and/or just general substance abuse. And I want to mention conduct disorder. Dr. Russell Barkley goes into a good amount of detail about conduct disorder. This, I'm not saying at all that you should pay for this at all, but this page goes through a lot of details about conduct disorder, and I might do a summary of this page, just because that is such an interesting topic. I'll link to this. Maybe I'll take a look at it in the future. And something interesting that Russell Barkley mentioned in one of his lectures is that if you have ADHD and conduct disorder, it's one of the biggest indicators of psychopathy. Yeah, it's a very dangerous combination, and a relatively large proportion of them. I don't know exactly what the proportion is in absolute terms, but relative to, the general population, if you have those two things, then the risk of bad things, just being a bad person, I very loosely speaking here, being a bad person in quotes, that risk is much higher. Okay. And that's what this paper is studying, and there's a ton of citations that support that. All right, and they summarize saying that it appears that ADHD individuals without substantial psychiatric comorbidities or substance abuse generally use their medication appropriately. So that's good news, that as long as you have no other serious issues going on psychiatrically, then the risk of stimulant misuse is much lower. In our sample, we found that conduct disorder and stimulant abuse were common among ADHD subjects who diverted. If they diverted, 83% of them had conduct disorder and 83% of them had substance abuse disorder. And if they misused, then 75% of them had substance abuse disorder and 58% had conduct disorder. So if you don't have conduct disorder, and if you have not had any kind of substance abuse or history of substance abuse, then the likelihood that you will abuse medication is now substantially lower. So if we take, let's see, 100 minus 58 is 42. So 42, this is the worst case scenario. If you don't have conduct disorder, let's see, 42 times 0.22. So there's a 9% risk that you will misuse or divert your medication. This is the absolute worst number I could give you. If we go by a slightly better number, let's say the 75%, if you don't have substance abuse, a history of substance abuse, and we multiply that by the rate of addiction or a misuse, then we have a 5.5% chance of misusing things. So actually a significantly low chance of diversion or misuse if you don't have conduct disorder or history of substance abuse. Yeah. And if you have a history of substance abuse, then of course one should be very careful. But I think this paints a pretty optimistic picture. That's not bad at all. And again, this is not even the best number. It's actually 83%. So if you don't have conduct disorder or a history of substance abuse, I just want to see it, 3.7% chance that you'll be prone to diverting. Okay, so not bad at all. Although the details and context of the inappropriate stimulant misuse remains unclear, it is well known that CD predicts a more pernicious outcome in ADHD, often resulting in comorbid antisocial disorder in adulthood. Yeah, so pretty big deal, this conduct disorder. If you have it, it's more likely that bad things will happen, unfortunately. Okay, the results of our literature, so this is now I'll just skim through the discussion here. The results of our literature search indicate that the misuse and diversion of prescription ADHD medications occur with from as low as 5% to as high as 35%. And this is especially prevalent among older adolescents and college-age populations. Larger survey studies typically result in smaller rates of stimulant misuse. Smaller single site studies, often with face-to-face interviews, report higher risk. And they pointed out exactly what I was confused about. And this, of course, makes things really hard to compare, right? Two studies that report on something similar with very different methodologies. This happens all the time in the sciences, and it's unclear to me how to fix it. And I'm sure people are thinking about this actively, but I won't go into that for now. It also remains unclear whether subjects with neuropsychological deficits or latent ADHD symptoms may be more vulnerable to misuse stimulants preferentially. In support of this notion, the Upadhyaya et al. Study found an association with stimulant misuse and current ADHD symptoms. Similarly, one survey study in junior and senior high school students found an almost 5-fold relative risk for stimulant misuse associated with a positive screen for ADHD. Yeah. This just makes sense if you have ADHD-like symptoms where you haven't been diagnosed, then you might try to find ways to self-medicate, including using stimulant medication, and unfortunately not as prescribed by a doctor. So that was in some studies, and then finally, to conclude, in summary, the available literature suggests that consistent misuse and diversion of the stimulants is occurring in adolescent and young adult samples, often in the context of academic performance and stimulant abuse, and is often linked with academic performance or their euphoric properties. Evidence of the misuse of stimulants to improve concentration and performance, as well as a relationship with undiagnosed ADHD, seems to exist, particularly in college-age youths. However, it is unclear how many of the subset of individuals who misuse stimulants actually have neuropsychological deficits or untreated ADHD, and the subsequent effects of treating ADHD on later stimulant misuse. The extant literature is limited by variable methodology, terminology, and outcome measures, as well as the lack of separation between single use and multiple uses, for example, frequency. That's right. So even if you have a metric by which you measure the rate of stimulant misuse, the metric, it might differ from study to study. So, I don't know how to fix this. Is kind of an issue with this particular field at the time. Anyways, 2007 is now a very long time ago. So I imagine it would be nice if they had a much more consistent set of criteria. So diagnostic criteria, for example, there's the Utah criteria or criterion. That's very consistent for diagnosing ADHD. And it would be nice to have something like that for these studies where outcomes have a consistent metric. Terminology is consistent between studies. That would be nice. But it's not really my field or my problem to fix. That's it. There you go. Incredibly dry. I hope it was helpful to see the information anyways, and then in the future, if you have questions for yourself, if people want to learn more about addiction abuse rates of stimulant medication in people with ADHD and without, then this paper is a pretty good starting point. And that table halfway through the paper, the one table they have, I won't bother to flip the view here, but this has a very solid summary of all that was done, the methodologies, the outcomes, and different notes that are relevant to each study. So really good way to get the data that you need. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for watching, and again, welcome if you're new here, and I hope you feel welcome. And for those of you who, for all the subscribers, thank you so much for the positive words and encouragement, and I'll keep going. Take care.